So this is the lecture for our third quiz, our third week of material that we'll be covering. Uh, the title of this week is called Vernaculars and Volunteers. So vernacular, as in vernacular language, that just means normal language, the language you use at home, spoken language, the language of the people, as opposed to, for instance, really literary languages or ancient languages, dead languages, um, languages that are used maybe in a paper, published paper, or in a university in an academic talk, but not the languages of the people. And volunteers, of course, we'll get to that, but the principle of volunteering, uh, of, of of doing Christian work by volunteers. So the first question asks why translation is impossible. This is basically because new meanings are always being created and being lost. So it's impossible for any two languages to be exactly the same, or even any two words between languages, because even if they mean something very similar, there's going to be a different field of a different cultural context for that word. And so Christianity, part of the strangeness of Christianity as a religion is its relationship to translation. Compared to other religions, it is much less emphatic in calling its original languages holy, much more happy to translate its languages. And this may be because Jesus was translated. The earliest texts that talk about Jesus talk about him in Greek, but he probably didn't speak Greek. He probably spoke Aramaic. I mean, he may have known it. He seems to be speaking Aramaic, even according to those Gospels. They often say, he said this word and it's translated as this. They give the meaning after making the sound. So translation and conversion also have a lot to do with each other, and incarnation, like the story of Jesus. And so, in a way, translation you can see as incarnation. God translated God's self and expressed what God is as a human being, as Jesus. And so, translate incarnation could be seen. Incarnation is the Christian term for God becoming. It could be seen as a kind of translation, and conversion is also another. Just like you need to convert your religion, you need to convert your language. You need to think about your language and your culture. There's also another principle that Walls talks about of revision, which is that translation can never really be finished. There has to be updates and better ideas. And pre-Christian Jews also think about translation in terms of the Septuagint, so that even before the Christians, we had this thing, this Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. And some of the stories about the Septuagint I think are very interesting. Read them in your book. I'd like you to flesh them out. Why was it translated? What's the miracle about that translation? Philo is a Greek-speaking Jew who's born right before Jesus, maybe about 50 years or so before Jesus, 20 to 50 years. And Philo is a very thoroughly kind of Hellenized Jew, and Hellenized means Greekized. Very familiar with Greek culture, very familiar with ideas. And so he's a very interesting person because he's not Christian, but he shows that many Jews were comfortable with Greek ideas being brought into their religion. And all of this was kind of abandoned. These translations were abandoned by Jews. I mean, Jews um, stopped using these kind of Greek translations and stopped bringing the Greek ideas, stopped being so comfortable with Greek ideas being brought into their religion. And it has something to do with Christians. And you talk about that too. Then on the third question is how do Christians translate their religion into Greek philosophy and culture? We talk about their Christianity's age. Even today, like back then, new religion is not exactly a good thing. People want new iPhones, not new religions, right? But Plato, Socrates, even the idea of the logos, which is kind of like the idea for logic or structure as well as word. A key point here is that in the Bible it says that Jesus is the one. There's the fourth evangelist, John, the Gospel of John, says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh." So that it's obviously pointing to Jesus as the Word. And in Greek, the original language, it says Jesus is the Logos. But Logos has a lot of meaning for these Greeks. So I want you to spell that out too. The name of God also changed. The name of God, the Lord, especially the word Lord, was used for the pantheon of Greek gods. So that's important. And the way Christians related to this name, Yahweh or Jehovah, the name of God, according to pious Jews, Christians became much more comfortable using phrases and calling out to this God. And early Christians experienced their scripture not as we do today. So we mostly sit alone. If we say read, you're thinking I'm sitting alone in my room reading. But reading is not neither individual nor is it silent. So I want you to talk a little bit about that too for this question. In four, Wofila is a prototype for future missionaries. What I mean is, what culture did Wofila come from? Wofila preach and try to convert his own culture or another culture? And what did he do in terms of language? How did he relate to his own people? How did he understand his own people? Similarly, Patrick, there's some interesting similarities and some interesting differences there regarding whether they were willing to translate the Holy Scriptures, what they thought about holy languages. And then the Protestant Reformation, which is this kind of great movement that happens in the 16th century, in the 1500s, in especially Northern Europe, where basically half of Europe, the northern half, breaks away from except for Ireland, special exception of Ireland, breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church and starts its own religion, Protestantism, which I mean can be considered is usually considered Christian. When in America, when they say, "Are you Christian or are you Catholic?" Usually, Christianity scholars think of Christianity as an umbrella term, with both Catholics and other Christians all considered Christians. But really, there's another kind of very different kind of flavor, a very different group of beliefs, a very different group of practices, and you can think about that in terms of language. The Protestants have a very specific relationship to language, which I think you can talk about a little bit more in this question. And then the fifth question: how has literary culture been central to European Christianity and consciousness? And what were Luther's critiques and what did language have to do with them? And then how did the rest of Europe adapt to new languages and texts? So literary culture has always been very important to Christianity and throughout Europe's history. But the main problem is kind of we can consider it, or the main difference, maybe it's not a problem, but the main difference between the early Christian world all the way up to the invention of the printing press is kind of a technical. So think about that and how that changed, how the individual consciousness developed as a result of technology, as a result of this print culture. Then Luther had some very specific critiques of the Catholic Church, of his ideas of salvation, particularly, and he had some ideas of language too. He wanted language to be used differently for the people. The Roman Catholic Church prized Latin as a holy language. All the way until 1967, all the masses in the world were spoken in Latin. And so there was this idea that Latin has priority. Luther had a different idea. And the English, who really followed Luther and his followers, especially a man named John Calvin, they adapted the Bible in a particular way, new languages and new texts, and along with other nations. Really, I want you to highlight here what scholars have pointed out the connection between the Protestant Reformation and these languages and nations. So, really, the rise of the nation state, the reason Europe is divided more or less linguistically, why France has the borders it does, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, England, well, of course, is an island, but Spain and Portugal. A lot of this has to do with language, and the scholars have pointed out that this period of time is key in the rise of kind of a national consciousness and linguistic consciousness. The sixth question is: were Protestants originally interested in mission? I want you to talk a little bit about this, not just give me a yes or no. Why were they, or why were they not? How did they recover the concept of translation? So, how is this concept already existing, and how did they build on it? Talk about some of the examples they've given, and that you've already read about other Christians, ancient Christians, who have also translated. Then how did the Protestant Reformation unintentionally spur Catholic foreign missions? This is kind of a fascinating topic too, in that the Protestants challenged Catholics, not exactly on missions, but one of the Catholic responses was to do a lot of missions. And this response included a lot of, on the individual level, the book explains why a Catholic might want to go on missions more. I want you to talk about that. And also the book talks about some institutional changes, like some societies that are set up, some ways in which Catholicism works with exploration, with foreign missions, even a whole new order, and where this term missionary first starts to be used in the way we're thinking about it. Professional person who crosses boundaries to try to bring the faith, or especially the Christian faith, to other people. The seventh question is about this new order, the Jesuits. What made them so successful in terms of their intellectual and spiritual preparation, their politics, and their idea of enculturation? What are some notable Jesuit successes and setbacks? And then how do Protestants initially get involved in overseas missions? So this is a whole set of questions, some of them about the Jesuits. They have a very particular set of disciplines, you could say, and emphases that help make them intellectually and spiritually prepared. Their politics are also kind of unique. They swear allegiance to the Pope. I want you to talk about what that means. Why is that important in this time? Why would it matter? Who is dominating the Catholic missions otherwise? And then inculturation is also a very special Jesuit idea about human beings and culture and God. What did they think? What did they think was right for people to do in terms of the Christian message? How much did they think it could be adapted to foreign cultures? Part of their choices on this caused backlash in the Catholic Church. So this is the setbacks. They caused political backlash from powerful Catholic leaders, caused religious backlash from powerful religious leaders, and there's a number of places you can talk about: Japan and Portugal, Brazil, China. The Jesuits are key to a lot of developments in all these places, and I want you to talk about where they succeed and where they fail. And then finally, the Protestants really they get involved in mission in a very interesting way. It has to do with their own colonial powers. There are some Protestant colonial powers, the Dutch and the British. What were the first kind of Protestant religious people to go overseas? And then how did they begin to get involved? What are the first things they do? Again, there has to do with language. And there's a key group of people, people you may be familiar with in a similar stage of life. Who are they? What's their so-called job before they go on missions, and where did they go? A group of Danish people that talks about in the book that go to India. What part of India? And what's their job? Like I said, and what they do there. Then the eighth question talks about translation and mission having important effects, even when people are not converted. And this has to do, again, with some of what we talked about before when they have a cultural effect and why there might be in a part of India certain statues of white missionaries, European missionaries, that are very respected in that culture. Why? What was going on? And then what did the rise of evangelicalism have? So evangelicals emphasize the kind of personal experience. It's flavored a lot of American Christianity. So if you hear people talking about, oh, it's about a relationship with God and with Jesus and this kind of thing, that's a legacy of a kind of evangelical Christianity that became very successful in America and all over the world. And they focused on certain people that really laid the groundwork for Christianity in America today. Certain, we would say, socioeconomic and racial or ethnic groups in America and elsewhere. And then lastly, there's voluntarism. And she gave us three kinds of, Dana Robert now, we're working on, she gave us three effects or assumptions that were dealt with voluntary societies. It had to deal with the kind of people who were involved, the kind of economic system that was involved, and even the kind of, could say, structure, family structure of the missionaries. Those were all changed because of this idea of voluntarism. Then finally, on nine, the last question, how were missions related to colonialism? How did they go along with colonialism? How did they resist colonialism? How and why did missionaries succeed in converting natives to Christianity and in changing non-European cultures? So in terms of actually converting natives, the missionaries were not directly successful, but you can't say they were unsuccessful either. So I want you to talk about that. Who was actually successful? It wasn't usually the European missionaries. There's a key group that's kind of in between, a link between the European. It's not like they had nothing to do with it. The European missionaries came, then, and about 100 years later, we see Christianity well established in many, many countries around the world. It's not that the Europeans had nothing to do with it, but they didn't manage to convert people themselves. So how did they do it? What happened? They gained a key group of people. And even when they failed, they had sometimes had huge effects on cultures. This is partly why people are still dealing with the legacy of colonialism. It's not only there was the force of politics, of soldiers, of markets, but there was also this kind of invitation on the part of the missionaries. The missionaries were oftentimes the only people who were without guns, who were not able to force their way of life, and they were rejected much more than soldiers and much more than markets were. But even when they were rejected, they often had a big effect on the world. And so that's another reason to study and to understand how this happened, this age of European missions. So that's it for this section. See you all on Friday.